Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eleni Arvanitis Sorba, and I am a professor here at the College of Law. Thank you for joining us today for this lecture, sponsored by McKercher LLP. Welcome as well to everyone joining us in the live stream. I acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Treaty 6 territory and the ancestral homeland of the Métis people. In honoring this land's rich history, we pay our utmost respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors who have shaped this place, and in doing so, reaffirm our profound connection with one another. Our college is grateful to McKercher LLP for its generous sponsorship of this lecture and others throughout the year. Thanks to McKercher, we can host a diverse roster of speakers who share their knowledge, experience, and insight with our college community and the wider public. I'd like to give our speaker, Leanne Bellegarde KC, a special welcome. We appreciate that she is taking time out of her busy schedule, and you'll realize how busy it is when she starts talking, to provide her insight. Her visit has been a long time coming. Some of you may recall Leanne was scheduled to speak in the college last March, but that event was derailed by an untimely snowstorm. We are delighted to have beautiful weather today and that she is joining us. This is one of the events happening in the college to recognize and celebrate International Women's Day, which is on Saturday, March 8th. In Canada, the theme for this year's celebration is Strength in Every Story, because every woman's story is a testament to resilience, determination, and the power of opportunity. In light of this theme, I think our speaker today is especially appropriate. Leanne Bellegarde KC is a member of the Peepeekisis First Nation of the File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council in Treaty 4. She lives and works in Treaty 6, Saskatoon. She is also a graduate of this college, receiving her LLB in 1991. Her career has spanned work in land claims, along with private, municipal, provincial, federal legal experience in sectors like gaming, telecommunications, post-secondary education, mining, and agrifood. Her career has increasingly focused on fostering mutually beneficial relationships with Indigenous peoples for economic prosperity, with an emphasis on employment and business opportunities. Her diversity and inclusion efforts have increasingly expanded to all diversity considerations, particular Indigenous, gender, and LGBTQ2 inclusion. Her volunteer and board experience have further exposed her at various depths to public safety and protective services, sustainable technologies, digital economies, culture and heritage, and education. As the founder of AconX, Leanne seeks to bridge the digital divide for Indigenous peoples using digital solutions grounded in Indigenous values. She is a governor of the University of Regina and vice chair of Saskatchewan Research Council and an advisor to Indigenous women in tech with Ethical Digital. Please help me in welcoming Leanne Bellegarde.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. As much as I'm having the pre-speech flush, coupled by a little menopausal reality, I always say yes to these things, and 2 years is a long time to get to one, but I always say yes, and then they come up, and I'm like, why did I say that? What do they want to hear? Why did I do that? And then I come speak, and usually at some point somebody will remind me that something I have shared has made a difference for them, and that makes it all worthwhile. But I think after I did this first request 2 years ago, I made a note in my journal: don't accept any more speaking engagements without 48 hours of thought. But this has been 2 years, so I'm stuck with that one. I'd like to thank McKercher for sponsoring and acknowledge the attendees here, and of Particular note is congratulate Gord on his of council, whatever that is. I think that's just the big rainmaker, right? They pay you to bring in lots of clients and maybe do a little bit of law in the process. But after the illustrious career you have, I'm not sure why I'm up here other than the sex differential. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're in the room of MLT Aikens, and you'll hear that MLT is where I articled. And so there's all kinds of anxiety coming back to me now at this exam time. And I'd like to acknowledge my special friend, Monica Goulet, who's here with me. She's a sister in spirit. We're sister BFFs, and known each other for a long time. And she remembers when I was a student, and I remember when she became a student and got her MBA when I was over at the Edwards School of Business. It was nice to talk to one of the faculty who knew me early on in both her career here and my start here. She had very kind words to say about my career. She said, "Oh, you've certainly been bold." It's like, well, that's a nice way to describe that I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. And really, I had no idea what the practice of law was about. I wasn't really sure what lawyers did. I think at that time LA law was big, so I knew the first thing you do was pour yourself a glass of water and wear a perfectly appointed padded shoulder jacket and a bodycon, perfectly pegged skirt, and showed up and saved the day. That has not been my experience, sorry. Really what drove me to law school was just simply a family value of education and hard work. My maternal side is French-German farmers from northern Saskatchewan. That is a lethal combination of hard work, religious, and perhaps high expectations of what should happen for the generations to come because they settled on that historical land that my mom married into when she became a status Indian by marrying my late dad, who was from the Peepeekisis First Nation. And in those days, non-Indigenous women could marry in and get status. And my dad's family had moved off the reserve when I think it was my grandparents moved off the reserve then. And so my experience was very largely urban, which is different from a lot of other people's. But I would tell you that there was a really high expectation and belief in education. On my maternal side, probably because that was, very traditional Catholic, first son becomes a priest, and that happened in my mom's family. Or the first one gets the farm, the second one becomes a priest, and the women go off to become teachers or something like that, and that's what happened to my mom. On my dad's side, I think the impetus was much different and very much shaped by the reality of being First Nations in Saskatchewan. And the reality and the treaty promise that education would be a way for next generations to learn a new way of life and be part of being able to continue an existing way of life as well as participate in the new life that was brought here. And I am always grateful of that expectation, but even more so for the treaty ancestors who years and years ago had the foresight to ask for and secure education benefits to ensure that we could make our way going forward. Now, that hasn't always been carried out the way that I think it was intended, but it certainly was a value that resonated from both sides of my family. So when I graduated high school, all I knew was I was supposed to go to university, and I actually started out in the College of Arts and Science and Sociology. I was going to be a social worker, and I hate to say this, no disparaging of those folks, but I quickly became bored and saw that it was not going to be the right fit for me. And I had a friend who was in law school at the time, and I was talking about this, and he just leaned forward and said, "I think you should be a lawyer." I was like, "Oh, really? Why?" And he said, "I think you'll really like it. You'll like the challenge. And have you heard about the Native Summer Law Center?" So thank God that non-Indigenous guy tweaked a spark of interest in me, and I, in very short order, wrote the LSAT, applied late for a bunch of law schools, did the Native Summer Law program, and lo and behold, started law school. I had no idea what law school would be like, but at least I'd been on campus for 2 years and knew where it was. And law school was torturous for me. There were only maybe 4 or 5 of Indigenous students who were students here at the time. I briefly walked through here before my anxiety got the better of me, and it was so refreshing to see symbolism of Indigenous people around the college, because that was not on this campus nor in this particular college to much extent when I got here. You had to walk across to the Native Law Center and you might find some. And who had time to do that? And so I found it very isolating, very lonely, and it seemed like everybody around me came from a family of lawyers or judges, or knew somebody in their family who was a lawyer or judge. I knew none. LA Law, as I said. And so I found law school very daunting. I quit after my first year, took a year off. My grandfather sent me back. Said, "You have to finish what you started out to do, my girl." And so I reluctantly came back and endured 2 more years. And when I was done, I was not planning on articling. And I just did not have a clue what the practice of law would be like. I was not sure that I wanted to venture into yet another unknown environment and be the other yet again. And this was still very early in my career. And so I walked over to the Native Law Center, and there was a posting for a job. I knew I needed to make some money. And it was a 6-month contract to work for the federal government. I can't remember what the unit was called at that time. I think it was specific land claims, and became an assistant, a very junior research assistant on the treaty land entitlement deal that was culminated in 1992. I knew nothing about what that opportunity meant or what it would mean to me. I just knew I needed a job, and it was 6 months, and it wasn't articling. And it was an incredible opportunity. It was probably the deeper dive into what it meant to be Indigenous in many respects, because I worked for the federal government in a tripartite arrangement with the province and the feds. And so I sat across from the Federation of what's now Sovereign Indigenous Nations and my relations. Leanne Bellegarde, I think, was the chief negotiator on that side. And I sat with the feds, notorious treaty breakers, not upholders, in the parlance I knew at the time, with the province, who were upstarts who did not know their place in the relationship. And so it was pretty schizophrenic for me. And I really had no idea of what was expected of me. It was an incredible learning experience. I got to work with Federal Department of Justice lawyers, long retired now, and there were some Saskatchewan justice lawyers. I think Mitch McAdam is still rattling around DOJ somewhere. And on the federal file, not only did we have DOJ lawyers, but we had private counsel. And James Kirby forever changed my life by taking me under his wing and giving me opportunity to work more directly on portions of that agreement than I had ever experienced. And Jim was one of the most conscientious, thoughtful, human, hard-working lawyers that I got to work by in a long time. And he was really instrumental in, I think, giving me hope that there was a place in the profession for me. And the DOJ federal lawyers were just happy to have a little Indian girl under their wing, and they wanted to teach me all kinds of things, and I was a bit jaded about the feds even at that point. There were some really important skills I learned working for the federal government as a young person with a law degree. One was the art of briefing, to scintillate huge amounts of information into no more than a 2-page briefing, sometimes with lots of attachments. But law school had prepared me very well for that. I don't know what a textbook looks like here, if you even have physical textbooks or if they're all online, but ours were huge. And it always amazed me by the end of a semester how much of that we'd gone through and how much we were expected to regurgitate. And so that ability to take copious amounts of information and come out with the essential principles and the story that they were to tell became really amplified through the frequency of briefings I had to do, especially because it was a very high-profile file in the federal government. And I didn't appreciate it at the time, but it was looked after by a senior deputy minister and up. And so the power of briefings resonated quite high around the overall outcome of the agreement. And I also learned to speak clearly and concisely, which you're probably not going to get as much of today, at least maybe not the conciseness. But I learned the art of oral briefing, which was not, like I'd heard at home. Take the garbage out or you're grounded. I only wish. But I learned very quickly the art of briefing. And I also got to sit around and watch other people work their ways, our more traditional approach of communication on the FSIN side and the provincial side. I learned the power of the pen. She who controls the drafting greatly influences the outcome. And when I say James Kirby was a workhorse, it was because he led the drafting. And it was a real privilege to learn how to do that with him, but very daunting to see the amount of work and detail, attention to detail that it took. I am not maybe as obsessively focused on detail as maybe you would like a lawyer to be, but I certainly learned from some of the best. And so I learned very quickly the power of the pen, but the importance of balancing interests, notwithstanding the bias you might want to express in doing so. So I learned that very early on. I got to sit around the back rooms, particularly with federal and provincial bureaucrats. And that was probably the harshest reality check as a young Indigenous professional. Because I could pass, I dressed appropriately, I was professional, I tried not to attract too much attention early on, believe it or not. And so they began to forget, I think at times, that I was a First Nations person. And the very candid views and interests they were seeking to get in the agreement were at times a very harsh awakening for me. And I remember the power of being the fly on the wall. And while it's much harder to be at this point in my career a fly in the wall, I do remember the power of having 2 ears and 1 mouth during those sessions. I've waited a long time for some of those people to retire, but they're not yet. And I learned to begin to find my voice from time to time, and probably the most compelling lesson I had was the federal negotiator was taking a sense of the federal team in the back room about where we thought negotiations had reached at a particular point. Did we have consensus? Were we ready to go through? Could he at least initial off the agreement to send it up the chain federally for approvals? And he went around the staff and asked if we thought we had achieved consensus. And everybody spoke so confidently, yes, yes, yes. And he came to me and I paused and I said, yes, but that was not how I felt. And I had picked up, again, from listening to the FSIN, the ways of communicating that they were expressing. And it was the first time that I had become really attuned to that. And I did not think ultimately that we were ready at that point. But I walked away from that internal briefing kicking myself. Why didn't I say that? Why didn't I speak up? That was not the way I felt. Why all of a sudden did I go along to get along? And I vowed to try not to do that ever again if I could help it. And I did speak to the federal negotiator after because I was right. And it wasn't because I wanted to tell him I was right. I wanted to tell him that I was sorry, that I had not spoken up earlier and perhaps provoked some discussion about the different views. And maybe not everybody else would have ended up going along to get along too. So I learned that very important lesson. When we concluded that agreement, I was really honored. It was about a year and a half later. By that point, I'd become an assistant negotiator of land claims with the federal government, and I was like, what the hell? How did that happen? 6 months, don't know what I want to do, don't want to article. Got offered an opportunity to work with the feds, and that would have meant a relocation to Vancouver. And they gave me an opportunity to go spend 6 weeks out there. And I learned that I'm a prairie girl at heart, that my homeland is here, truly, and once and for all. I was so lost in a huge city where it rained all the time, and I was stuck between the mountains and the water with nowhere to go. And a lifestyle that probably meant that I would not have my own home. It would be a long time before I had one. I would probably never really want to own my own car. Did a lot of public transport. Even tested out taking the ferry to work once in a while. And my late dad, who was a survivor of residential school, had been experiencing since my birth, actually, heart problems because he had rheumatic fever when he was in residential school. Poor nutrition, poor living conditions, and a whole lot of other things contributed to what became for him early on in his life heart damage. And there are many, many Indigenous people who later in life suffer various forms of heart damage and don't know why. And it's often because they had rheumatic fever, which was not documented very well or treated very well at the time. I didn't want to leave him because we were always living with the sentence of how much longer he would go. He'd had 2 open heart surgeries, had an artificial valve, one of the first pig heart valves they had in. And I just couldn't see leaving my family during that time. And Jim Kirby really thought it was important to encourage me to consider articling. I know, it's just articling. The only thing I knew about articling was it was a lot of grunt work, a lot of long hours. And at that time, exams here were generally 100% every term. The bar exams at that time were 100% over, a 6-week period. You studied hard and you did that. I'm not a good exam taker. I have a lot of test-taking anxiety. I know that now. I didn't know that then. I thought I was just a failure and inept and didn't work hard enough. And none of those things were true. But I decided to apply for the articling position, and they gave me a position. And remember, of course, having up my attire because, they were kind of a bougie law firm then. I don't think that's changed much now. I had no idea really what to expect, and thank God Jim was my principal because he made it a lot more palatable, and he was, again, very thoughtful and conscientious about the experience. I can remember the first time. In those days, we had dictaphones, and we dictated our work into dictaphones. You didn't have computers you could talk into that just did that, or AI now who will just whip things up for you. And I remember the first time I had a piece of work to dictate. Even Jim's secretary that we shared was so kind, his assistant. She just laughed because I didn't know that you were supposed to say first paragraph, blah, 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 period. Blah, 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 period. Next paragraph. It was just one long monologue with no hints of anything. And they were so gracious. They don't let me, they don't tell me this, but quietly Jim took me aside and sort of explained how it was to be done. I get so embarrassed after the fact. Later today and tonight and tomorrow, I will be embarrassed about things I may recall saying, okay? but at that time, it was particularly acute. I learned about the grind of practicing law and the business of practicing law, and they don't tell us much about the business of practicing law, and how every minute counts. And at times in my career, I have felt that pressure of making every minute count and have become overly committed to being productive as a result at the expense of downtime or non-billable time. And it's taken a long time to let go of that. But the thing I didn't let go of was the importance and the value of my time and the increasing distillation of knowledge that I can spew out in those 6-minute increments, and the value that that has. So you can imagine after 30-some years, I feel that I have very valuable time. And I try to remember that. And it was my first insight into how slow the law can be. I knew as an Indigenous person, as a treaty person in this country, that our people had been here since time immemorial. I knew a bit about the generational concept of how we looked back at things and carried that forward. But there is nothing like the wall of bureaucracy and systemic racism to sit you on your ass, quite frankly. And I came to see that despite my hopes that things in the field of law would be different and I could be a champion for change, I did not want to continue practicing till well beyond 100 into my time immemorial to see the changes that I thought would need to be done. But I did realize that I had learned some lessons and could have some influence and be a change agent in other ways and at other places. And I think that's when I began to explore, after I completed my articles, what my other options were. Now, I think I applied for that first job. I had to apply by invitation to my second job, and similarly for my third job when I became the city solicitor and left MLT. At that time, I was in my first marriage and had a young stepchild, partial custody of, and the grind of law was not one I wanted to live. It was not about the balance I was coming to understand that our people taught. And don't get me wrong, I don't think balance means every aspect of your life is absolutely equal and well managed. I think balance changes at different times of your career, but I was not prepared to make that commitment to be a lawyer's lawyer and devote myself as diligently with extended billable time through a 24-hour day. So I went to the city solicitor's office, and municipal government was absolutely interesting. Made a difference to me in terms of how powerful the impact of decisions made could influence people's lives so directly, and there was a bit more speed to things. Absolutely. At a municipal government. And that was the first time that I had a female boss, and that was Teresa Dust at the time. And I really appreciated her style. She was much more collaborative and very strategic, but in a, not an alpha female wolf kind of way, but she could be. And God help you if she was. But she had an ability to know and identify the competing interests very well. You're laughing because you remember Teresa, don't you? Yeah, yeah. That was when His Worship Mayor Henry Day was still mayor. And so I began to appreciate what it was like to have a female boss. And she managed her time in a much more balanced way than I knew. Are you crying for her? Crying for those times in municipal politics. And so I really enjoyed that. It was also my first exposure to a workplace strike. And I was one of the people that was not assigned to some ignoble job, unless you think bylaw court is an ignoble job. But I was not cleaning out the zoo or at the water treatment plant. I got to stay in the office, and I got to second chair to MLT, who was outside counsel on the strike. And so I started to develop an interest in labor and employment more than anything. But mostly I got to see Teresa Dust in action and work her way, and a couple other senior female leads that were at the city. And it was very interesting to me to see that form of leadership, because Teresa presented herself. I think she had like the capsule dressing down pat more than anybody else, but she taught me the power of not having distraction by how you present yourself, and the power that gives to your voice and your actions. And I always admired her, although I never wanted to be quite that boring in the selection of a uniform. After that, I actually ended up in Regina working for Saskatoon, where there was another labor dispute, and MLT was again the council on that, and so I got to second chair on that one too, and honed my labor skills, labor and employment skills. I was no longer applying for jobs at that point. I was being invited or told of an opportunity that they really hoped I would apply to. And that's a very different experience than throwing your resume on the wall and hoping it'll stick somewhere. So I'm grateful for that. It was a great experience there. I learned Crown Corporation realities and provincial government realities in a whole new way, and those were invaluable experiences. I was then called to work back for the FSIN. A cousin, then Perry Bellegarde, was chief of the FSIN, and he wanted to bring our own people back wherever possible. He was one of the first graduates of the First Nations University, and so he really wanted to bring us back to our home and make contributions there. And that was always kind of at the back of my mind, that obligation that I should be giving back to my community, and I really wasn't sure how I was doing that. And I worked on the treaty governance table, and I was general counsel there, and I began to see the other side of that tripartite table I'd first been introduced to. And the real tension between our First Nation ways of knowing and doing and government. And how this was so very hard to raise up and encroach into that space, and how domineering and dominant the federal and provincial government could be. And I didn't know at the time the value of two-eyed seeing or creating ethical space, but I did get to see it in action throughout my career. And being a lawyer for our own organizations is much different than for any other client group, because it was really the place where I learned the most about being a First Nations person. as I walked into my office after being appointed and leading treaty governance negotiation tables, in my perfectly shoulder-padded suit and my perfectly tight but appropriate length pegged skirt and appropriately demure heels, the elders came in, placed some pillows on the floor. I had to kick off my shoes. They invited me to sit down and learn what it really meant to work in our organization. And that was the greatest education I ever got, was to work with the treaty elders of Saskatchewan on that table. There were many other experiences, not so favorable, but that was absolutely life-changing for me because I didn't grow up in our communities. I grew up off reserve, and I'd experienced, unbeknownst at the time, a lot of discrimination. I just didn't even know what it was. Because you have to know enough about your indigeneity to understand what racism and sexism is all about. And they gave me some invaluable teachings, and many of those elders have passed away now, but that was really where my journey into identity became. And the power of our own laws, values, and principles became known to me through those sacred holders of it. And I began to feel a connection that I had never felt anywhere else to that point in my life, not even in my family system. Because they cannot talk about our stories and our ways without it being rooted in that connectedness that the Creator made in us to each other and to everything. And that was just such a powerful, powerful lesson. And I think that was my greatest teaching, and those are teachings that I don't have the same ability to share about because of the sacredness in which many of them were given. But you know, as all things go in our own organizations, there's tribal, family, kinship politics, and there's a time to move on, and that became clear when I had my first baby. And again, I was a really hard worker, overly productive, still watching all my time, and putting in a lot of time. And I just didn't think that was going to fit with having a baby. And so while I was on mat leave, I began to dabble in consulting. And Indigenous awareness was a new thing then. It was not, this was all pre-reconciliation. And so I began to do that, and I began to do a lot of that with John Lagemodiere, who continued to do that for much of his career. And it was essential for me to learn about all of those things in some detail that impacted me, the laws and policies, very little of which I'd been introduced to at law school as it then was, and shaped very much my identity and my passion to make change, and honed, again, the level of research skills and communication skills that I had started to really foster in law school. And I did pretty good, and I actually even started my own private practice. And that was because I didn't want to work in a firm with all of those requirements around me about the administration and the business of law. I wanted to give myself more flexibility. Well, you can't really do that in the practice. Again, lots of rules, a bureaucracy of its own. But I became very successful very quickly, serving Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And my then cousin, Edmund Bellegarde, took over SIGA after the Dutch Leroy era. And he invited me to be their outside counsel. And it was in the renewal of SIGA. And so we, over the course of a couple of years, he then invited me to take a position there. And I have to give credit to MLT because they were very instrumental in teaching me how to run the practice of law and in giving me associate arrangement. I think they were way ahead of their time. And I'm always grateful because I was the first First Nations person, let alone woman, that they had at their firm at that time. And I didn't screw it up too badly because now they have a very robust group of Indigenous lawyers who followed. I moved over to SIGA, and it's funny, SIGA undertook its first strategic plan. I hadn't been a real fan of strategic planning. I'd been on some boards, and I thought it was a lot of navel gazing, and I could not understand the need to put things in these short little pithy terms. And what do you mean we have to state our values? Don't we just live our values? I was seeing the intersection of my two worlds come very much in what was happening around strategic planning. And so we brought out the Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan Speak, the book that had been part of the treaty governance process outcomes. And the very high-profile strategic firm who came in to do that had hit a stuck point. And there was just no participation from around the table of our senior managers. And I said, let's bring this out. I said, I think that you got to change your format a little bit around how you do this, and you have to let people tell their stories. And maybe they'll tell their stories around these teachings from our elders. And that strategic plan took shape in a way that I think has come to set a standard for many Indigenous organizations' strategic plans as a result. And it's been refined even more. And the power of our teachings has become more reflected in all of our organizations and in other organizations as a result. So as you look to decolonize and as you look at reconciliation, you have more awareness of those teachings now than were ever evident 30 years ago in the world of business and the intersection of the two. This was also at the time that SIGA was looking to have a casino downtown. At the same time, I was also on the police commission, and I was the first First Nation woman, never mind civilian, chair of a police commission in Saskatoon. That was after the Starlight Tours. And it was a time of great scrutiny, and it was there that I honed my ability to handle media and to handle public racism and sexism, because it was everywhere. I couldn't leave my house without maybe a neighbor, the police doing the drive-by. My neighbors, I should think, were pleased by the heightened police presence in our neighborhood. It was a bougie neighborhood, too. And I couldn't go to the corner store with my kids without somebody wanting to talk to me about policing and about the Starlight Tours. Everybody had an opinion, and what profoundly hurt the most, though, was how many people thought that as a First Nations woman, I had no place in these worlds. There was even an article, an editorial, I remember, and it's because the people who love me were so worried about the impact on me. There was an article in the Star Phoenix about why would we even have a First Nation civilian chair? She doesn't even pay taxes. That's how ignorant they still were. I've owned a home, I've paid taxes, I've worked off reserve, I shop at the same stores, but all of a sudden that became the stereotype that was more rigidly foisted on me than I had experienced any other point in time. And I really had to find my sense of self very powerfully. And thank God I'd had those teachings of those elders and became more introduced to ceremony and our ways of keeping ourselves strong. I left SIGA and went to do some more consulting and private practice with a much narrower focus because I was tired of being the focus. But I wasn't enjoying it that much, and it's really hard to maintain a private practice with reduced hours and get everything done that you want to have done. And so I was debating what to do, and Dean Lynn Pearson of the Edwards School of Business called me up. And she became my next female boss, and invited me to work in the School of Business to engage and influence curriculum there. And I was very fortunate because there was a lot of donor funds. I was not caught up in the university administration. And I got to tell you, of all the bureaucracies I've worked in, I think the university administration is the hardest to figure out, the slowest to move, but everybody always wants to talk and has an opinion. Way more than any place else I've experienced it. But I got to bypass some of that stuff. And this was where I began to really understand the power of community in institutions like this, and the importance of Indigenous centers, where we can see other like-minded people, where we can just be ourselves and not face the constant imposition of other worldviews, values, biases, and stereotypes on us. And I think they're still incredibly important. And I got to do hands-on mentorship, I guess, and I never thought of it as mentorship or coaching. I extended the same hand that had been extended to me throughout my career. And people who believed raised me up. Even if a lot of them were white guys, that worked too. And so I tried to do that. And what became really clear for me is that the systemic racism and sexism was really internalized, and we know that now as intergenerational trauma from residential schools. And that limited our own beliefs of what we could do for ourselves, and it didn't have to. That we could take each other's hands, go to the tables together, and there was greater power and ability to raise each other up there. And that was where Monica came back from her teaching education and her career and considered that she could and did get an MBA. And I saw many students do that, and many students finished degrees that otherwise languished after second or third years, because we raised each other up, we pulled each other along, we walked beside, and we kicked from behind if we had to. And because we understood our reality, it made a huge difference. And so I'm a big believer. I got seconded to Potash Corp from there. They wanted to lead Indigenous inclusion, and that was my first time inside a big corporation. I knew an Indigenous member of the board, Keith Martell. He'd been a longtime colleague, an acquaintance, and he called me up and said, we're having trouble getting this right. They've tried a lot of people. Do you think that you want to do this? And I said, let me think about it. Because at that point in my life, I learned I had a choice. I didn't have to take the next great opportunity. And I could think about it. I took it on a 6-month basis. By that time, I think Lynn Pearson had retired. We were through 5 deans at the Edwards School of Business. It was an exciting opportunity to go to a private corporation, and I knew I would be supported there, and I was. And that is probably the place where I saw the simplicity of purpose and leadership in action, and how important the tone at the top really was. I'd seen it in political organizations and government. This is the first time I saw it in a corporation. Then CEO Bill Doyle and that board gave me a lot of backing, a lot of time at the table, the board table, and I wasn't even a senior executive. Although between us, I probably should have been, especially by the end of my time there. And how influential that tone at the top sets the culture for an organization, and how much that can change and be lost in a merger and going global. And so I learned a lot about leadership there, and I learned a lot about allyship from my non-Indigenous colleagues around all of the tables throughout that project. And I am always grateful to my non-Indigenous allies like Jim and Bill and Wayne and a whole bunch of others, because they would lend me their influence, and I didn't even know they were doing it when I wasn't in the room. Or if I was in the room and I said something, they would defer and refer to what I said. And that is the power of allyship. And I didn't see that as much from women, not just because there were fewer women, but because women relied on male leadership like I had to and allyship like I had to. We were making our own way. We barely had enough to give to each other. And I think that's the important thing that at this phase of my career is the most important, is lending that female allyship to other women. That you don't have to fit in and conform. It isn't about what you wear. It is very much, though, about how hard you work and how well you communicate, and you can persevere. And we need to raise each other up, and there are more of us around the tables now than ever. And my joy in my consulting now, I call it my selective retirement. I do governance training, a lot with Indigenous organizations, but organizations that are looking for a more collaborative approach reflected in that directing mind of the institution made up of individuals. I also still do a little bit of Indigenous awareness and inclusion consulting. And recently I have started to become a sober recovery coach, and I'll end on this note. When I was 16 years old, I had fallen into the throes of alcoholism and drug addiction. In hindsight, which is always 2020, it was the reality of being the little brown girl in the neighborhood with a reserve off to the side, trying to figure out where I fit in and not sure where I fit in. It was understanding the way the pain evidenced itself in my dad and in his family, often as alcoholism and drug addiction, withdrawal, inability to show emotions, the loss of family systems. My mom's harsh upbringing, German, French, Catholic, farming. That pain that carried with me, and we now know that intergenerational trauma impacts us at a cellular level and increases that propensity to fall throws to the pain relief we seek, which for me was alcoholism, was alcohol and drugs. And I very quickly spiraled out. I was able to recover at a young age. I was 16 years old when I went through treatment, got clean and sober, and have stayed that way for over 41 years. And what I learned in that recovery time has been very much the principles that have guided what I understand about leadership and caring. It has helped me embrace more fully my identity as an Indigenous person, and it has helped me with two-eyed seeing and building that ethical space that allows me to come and talk to you in a more vulnerable way than I might have ever felt I could or should as a young lawyer, trying to portray the image of that infallible JD where everybody thinks you're something, know everything, right and wrong, expect you to, and hold you to a higher standard as a result. I can give myself some freedom. So I'm grateful to be back here because it's been a long journey. And oh, what a ride it's been. And I still am not sure what I want to be when I grow up, but I'm having a hell of a time finding out. And I sure know a lot about what I don't want to do. And sometimes that's more important. Raise each other up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for sharing your journey with us. I would like to now open up the questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones on either end if you want to come up and ask Leanne a question.
Or you can catch me after, or you can find me. I think they have my contact information too. So I'll just say this. I always hated Q&A because I was always scared to speak up, but feel free if you want to, just cut me off and interject. But one of the things that I've always done to pay it forward is always made the offer. If you want to contact me, Leanne Bellegarde KC at gmail.com, and you can call me, and I will always find time. And everybody through my 7 or 8 year career of university would never let me pay for my own lunch or coffee or dinner, and I pay it forward for students too. And I would love to have a coffee, a lunch, or a chat anytime, especially if you're not all invited up to the free one after this. So, but if there's any questions or comments, happy to take them. Thanks so much.
Right. I would like to invite one of our students, Emily Zuntney, to present a gift to Leanne on behalf of our college community. Thank you.
Let's do it over here. See it and you can get on the camera.
Thank you for being here today, finally, after last week. Thank you for sharing your words of wisdom and your humor with us, and I'm sure we can all take something from it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck to you. Thank you again. Thank you to McKercher and MLT, the College of Law, and to you.